So that's what I had, and I want to share with you now, as part of my topic, what we call the Angus Project at ONA. And it comprises really 3 different focuses that we have had and research that we've done on this topic. As an overview, you all know that Florida is primarily a cow-calf state, right? And that's primarily a commercial cow-calf state. And so the introduction of bulls to serve our commercial cow herds is significant into the state. We don't produce enough herd bulls to supply our needs. And so there's a large influx of bulls into our state every year. A lot of these bulls have Black Angus genetics involved with them. In fact, the introduction of purebred Angus genetics is significant across the state, predominantly in Central and South Florida. Now, that would give you some ideas for discussion, and all of you have been involved in these discussions about whether or not the Black Angus breed is adapted for Central and South Florida. And so there's been ideas and even practices that have been implemented. Should we select these cattle from tropical, subtropical herds, or at least herds in the southeast? Would that make the bulls more adaptable? Maybe import these bulls as yearlings and then grow them here until they're 2 years of age before they're first used on our commercial cow herds. Many of you utilize that practice today if you're utilizing Black Angus bulls. And then the final one is, does it even matter? Most all of you sitting in this room, if your commercial cow herd is in Central and South Florida, you're utilizing a winter breeding season anyhow. And you know, this is pretty easy living down here in December, January, February, March, isn't it? That's why all of our winter visitors come here during that time of year. And the Angus bulls, in terms of their ability to thrive and breed cows and work in our commercial cow herds, are no problem at all. It's a much different story in the summertime, but in a winter breeding season, maybe it's not even a concern. So all of these questions, debates, and discussions are things that we've all been involved in. And so we wanted to research that, and this was a study that was done in collaboration with Dr. David Riley, who's here today, back when he was here in Florida, Dr. Chad Chase, Dr. Sam Coleman, and a few others as well. And what we did is we collaborated with 2 herds, Angus herds. One is a very modern, productive, really an outstanding seed stock Angus herd in Kansas. We would consider that the outside source herd, reared in a temperate environment in central Kansas. And the other was a herd that we would consider, or at least thought to consider, as an adapted Angus herd. And this was a herd that was generated at Brooksville, Florida, over 50 years of selection in our environment. Okay, and so we labeled these outside and local herds, one in Kansas and one in Florida. And we derived 125 embryos from each of those, so 250 embryos total. And we brought those embryos here and transferred them into Brahman British crossbred cows at the Research Center at ONA. And we did it over 3 consecutive years. From those transfers, we got 81 live calves. And we evaluated those calves through their sexual maturity, for both heifers and bulls. And then the bulls were retained and used as terminal cross sires on a straight-bred Brayford herd at the Research Center. Now, if we look at their temperatures, we didn't see any differences in a core body temperature. In this case, we were measuring ear temperature, tympanic temperature, among the 2 sources, local or outside. And the range was the same as well. We looked at hair coat score, which I'll explain a little bit more later, and saw no difference between the local and outside source as calves growing through their first year of sexual maturity. There was a difference in that the bulls tended to have longer hair coats than the heifers, but there was no effect of source. Now, what we did find, and what you might expect or maybe not expect, is that the outside source cattle, the cattle that came from Kansas, had greater body weight at weaning, and they had greater body weight gain as measured by weight per day of age. They were larger in terms of hip height. And so this probably is not surprising, because this came from a modern Angus herd that was selected for productivity traits, whereas the herd in Brooksville, Florida was selected primarily for longevity traits. Okay? What is interesting is the age at first conception. So after the time of weaning, these heifers were exposed to a fertile bull and left with that bull throughout their first, I think, almost year of life. And so what was their first age at conception? What we found is that the outside source heifers conceived at a much younger age than the local source heifers, a much younger age. And so when we published this paper, let me just show you the last piece of data first. I'm sorry, this says kilograms at the top, but I did convert that to pounds. And so the data on the graph is in pounds. There was a tendency for the outside source bulls, when used as terminal cross sires, to produce larger calves. All right, and again, this follows the data of they and their sisters' productive lives as being larger and having greater body weight gain. And there's an example, or at least a picture, of one of those bulls with the Brayford cow herd. And so if we looked at that over those 3 years, and when this study was published in 2011, every single important production parameter that we measured, the outside source modern Angus cattle performed better in terms of body weight gain and age at first conception or time of puberty than did the local Florida source Angus genetics that were selected for adaptation, or at least selected for longevity. All right, so that paper was published, and that was really the take-home message at that time. And then about 5 years later, Dr. Vendermini and I had a discussion as we started to notice several of our Angus cows being culled from the herd from being non-pregnant. Okay? And we started to look at those more closely and found that the majority of those females being culled were coming from the outside source herd. And so if we looked at the cows that were being retained within the herd, those were heifers that were derived from embryos from the local source herd. Again, selected for longevity. So now after we get out past 2 years of age, we're starting to recognize some of the value of longevity in a herd that may show some adaptation for the Florida environment. And so we asked the question, why? Why are these cattle different? And so we entered into another study, and this was the second study, where we collected data from the remaining Angus cows in the herd. At that time, those cows were 5, 6, and 7 years of age. We didn't have many of them, but you can see the distribution here and what they looked like at that time. And then I will show you some of the responses that we saw. And so we conducted this study over 3 consecutive years using our local source and outside source cows. These were all cows that had calves on the side. As long as they conceived and calved in that year, they were eligible to be enrolled in the study or data collection for that year. And then we evaluated those cow-calf pairs in March, April, May, and June in each of those 3 consecutive years. The dependent variables included cow and calf body weight. All of the calves had the same sire. The only difference was the cow body condition score, cow hair coat score, which I'll explain, and then cow milk production using the weigh, suckle, weigh technique. And I'll explain that too as we go. Here is the hair coat scoring system that we used, and this is a system now that's accepted by BIF. It was developed by Joe Cassidy from North Carolina State University, and it's on a 1 to 5 scale, where 1 would be a slick, short summer hair coat, and 5 would be a full, unshed winter hair coat. And Dr. Vendermini and I independently scored the cows each of those months within each of those 3 years, and then averaged our score together for a final hair coat score. And so here are some of the results. Body weight in March and body weight in June. March was our first month in each year that we collected data, and June was our last. And although not significant, it's not surprising that the outside source, the modern Angus herd, those cows numerically had larger body weights, but they had less body condition score in each of those, in those 2 months. Less body condition score, but larger body weights. The calf body weights, again, larger for the outside source genetics, the modern Angus genetics, and less for the local Angus genetics. So that would translate to greater body weight gain for those calves, coming from the same sires, but different mothers in terms of their source that they were derived from. So, here's the hair coat score, and what you see is that there's really no differences in May and June between the two sources, but in March there is a difference, whereas the cows, the mature cows that came from the outside source in March and April shed their winter hair coats slower than did the local source cows. If you look at this in terms of average score, you see that the outside source cows from Kansas on average have longer hair coats, but they have a greater score change. So they ultimately shed those hair coats, but they do it much slower. So if you're breeding in a January or February to April or January through March breeding season, you can see that it's important that these cows probably shed their hair coat quicker so that they maybe are under less heat stress during that breeding season. But here's what is probably even more important, and that's milk production. Now, we use the weigh, suckle, weigh technique, and what that involves is that you separate the cows and calves in a dry lot pen for a period of time. We generally do it overnight, maybe about 12 hours. And then you weigh the calf, you allow the calf to suckle the cow, and then you weigh the calf again. And that difference in body weight is an estimate of milk production. But it almost always underestimates total milk production. But when you compare two distinct treatments like we're doing here, it does a pretty good job to discern differences. And what we find is that those outside source cows are producing about 75% more milk than our local source cows. One thing that Dr. Riley mentioned to me this morning is that it's fairly well known that selection for milk production also coincides with hastening the age at puberty. So you have cows achieving puberty or heifers achieving puberty at earlier ages when selected for greater milk production in that cow herd. And you saw that earlier on, that these cows achieved puberty at a much younger age. And so among those females then, compared to non-adapted outside source Angus, the cows have greater pre-weaning body weight gain. Compared to local source adapted Angus dams, the outside source dams have less body condition score, and we know that's probably related to that much greater milk production, and they are slower at shedding their spring hair coats. And so I think that one of the important things to point out here in this data set, if I've kept your attention through this time, you might remember that when Dr. Vendermini and I started to notice that there was a difference, we had already culled several of the outside source cows. So the cows that were left to evaluate were probably the best of the worst. And so the data is a bit biased towards those cows, right? And even among those outside source cows, there are a small handful that are still at the research center today that have performed very well. They've gotten pregnant every year, they've weaned and produced large calves, and when we look at those cows individually, as individuals against the other cows within their same source, interestingly we find that they shed their hair coats sooner, and they produce about 1/3 less milk than those that were culled from the herd. And so we feel somewhat comfortable to suggest that hair coat shedding and milk production are two variables in the Black Angus breed that have an impact on overall productivity when we treat these females as we do our commercial cows. So with that, I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you about a third project that we call the White Angus Project. and explain to you a little bit about where these cows come from, how they differ from their Black Angus counterparts, and what the herd is comprised of today and how we may be caring for these cows in the future. So where did they come from, the Ona White Angus? Well, it's a distinct breed. We're calling it a breed today, but it clearly originated from crossbreeding, as many breeds do, and it was developed at the Range Cattle Research and Education Center in Ona. It's a coloration anomaly that's not fully understood even today. And I really appreciate Dr. Riley's talk when he described about there are coloration patterns that we just don't fully understand. But I will tell you, there's a lot of people that have tried to explain to me why these animals exist and why the coloration pattern is there. And somewhere among everyone's thoughts probably is the truth. And we're going to have to try to figure that out over the years to come. But they were derived from several crossbreeding programs, and the one that I'm pointing out here is from Mac Peacock, who was an animal breeder at the Range Cattle Station. And he did a long-term crossbreeding study that involved 3 purebreds: the Brahman, the Gray Brahman, the Black Angus, and Charolais. And he looked at all of the reciprocal crosses and the productivity of both those purebreds and crossbred offspring. When he retired, that herd was now comprised of all of those 3 breeds. And the new faculty member that was hired, she was a reproductive physiologist, and she was interested in looking at fertility traits when using Sembra bulls on this herd. Now, the Sembra, being a composite of Simmental and Brahman, introduced a 4th breed. And then in 1998, when I arrived there, I inherited the herd, and I began to breed them to Black Angus bulls. Why did I do that? Well, I never lived in South Florida before, and I didn't know anything about beef production here. And that's the case for a lot of people that moved to Central and South Florida. And what I saw here was a lot of Brahman cattle being used on commercial cow herds. If you grew up in Indiana and Kansas, all you hear are bad things about Brahman. So I didn't understand why we did that and why that was important. And Finley Pate, who was the director at the time, tried to explain that to me. But I think that the quote that I heard the best was at a beef cattle short course one time with a researcher from either LSU or A&M, I'm not sure where, and he explained it to me the best and said to the group, he said, people that live in warm climates, particularly in Central and South Florida, they use the Brahman until they can't stand it anymore, and then they get away from the Brahman until they can't survive anymore. And that's true. And I had adopted, using that line, what is happening to us with the Black Angus. People don't use the Black Angus until they can't stand it anymore, because it's in our face all the time. And then they use the Black Angus until they can't survive anymore, as you saw here. And so it's a pendulum between the two that we go back and forth. And it's the reason why today some of our best Black Angus herds, in my opinion, reside in the state of Florida and Central and South Florida, because it's the combination of the two that seems to give us the best performance. And so in the early 90s, they were bred to Sembra bulls. And in 1999, we began to breed them to Black Angus and Brangus bulls. And about 2002, we started to recognize that there was a growing number of cows that, whenever they were bred to these black bulls, would produce white calves. Now, that's strange, but it's not entirely unheard of. But what is even more strange is that when you start to breed those white females that are half-blood Black Angus to Black Angus, they would produce white calves again that now are 3/4 Black Angus with dark skin. And so we started to try to understand and focus this herd a little more in terms of our breeding efforts. And so originally we focused on producing white Angus calves that were genetically 7/8 Black Angus, but that hasn't worked well. We can produce 3/4 Black Angus that are white, but when we take that 3/4 and breed it to a Black Angus bull, the success rate of producing white goes down dramatically. But it's not unheard of. Here's an example of a 7/8 Black Angus heifer that is now a cow in our herd, and she's an embryo transfer daughter from the ABS bull mandate. There were 3 heifers born to that flushing, and 2 are solid black, and then she is white. I think I might have a picture of her standing next to her black sisters. Anyway, she has all of those at least have come from one cow that now have 3 7/8 Black Angus daughters in the herd. Today, however, we're focusing on producing 3/4 Black Angus instead of trying to pursue this 7/8 role by breeding 3/4 Black Angus cows, white cows, to 3/4 Black Angus white bulls. Those offspring are almost 100% white. And so here's what we have proposed that could be done with this herd. And at some level, if the herd remains to be owned by the University of Florida, we will try to attempt to achieve this. But right now, if you think about the herd of what we call Ona White Angus that are 3/4 Black Angus, they are all derived from a small group of foundation cows that are 50% half-blood Black Angus. In fact, there's only 22 of those cows remaining in the herd. That gives us a very small genetic pool on the maternal side. But we have an endless pool on the sire side, because we can breed them to any Black Angus bull that we choose to produce the 3/4 White Angus, 3/4 Black Angus, which is white, that we call the Ona White Angus. And so it's incumbent upon us to try to increase that genetic diversity by using a large number of Black Angus bulls with these remaining foundation White Angus cows. And the only way to do that is through embryo transfer or through in vitro fertilization. And so by going through an embryo transfer program and estimating about 4 viable embryos for every flushing, and remember, the ratio of white is only 50%. The other 50% are black. So when that cow is bred to a Black Angus bull, she produces half black, half white, with no dilution. We've never gotten a diluted color, any other color. It's either solid black or solid white. At about a 50% ratio, we would achieve about 96 live calves, heifer calves, in the first year. We can also do the same thing with our Ona White Angus, which that herd is growing rapidly, and could achieve in the first year about 1,200 White Angus embryos in year 1. And so this is an idea that we have and an area that we want to go. You might wonder, what are some of the advantages? Well, we worked in a study with Cornell University where the researchers there in the agriculture engineering department were looking at sweating rates or respiration rates among cows of different breeds and from around the country. And these data are published now where they've shown the Ona White Angus to have 80% greater sweating rates when compared to the Black Angus counterparts. And this is in direct solar loads. What's also interesting in this study is that the black cows that are being compared here are half-sisters. They have the same sire as the white cows, just different mothers. So that made it, the study somewhat more interesting. And so this adaptive response results in cooler body temperatures during periods of high heat load. And what we found is that those Ona White Angus cows spend more time during the summer daylight hours grazing than do their black half-sisters. They also, this response being lower vaginal temperatures. Dr. Pete Hansen worked with us here where he allowed us to use the vaginal temperature probes that he showed you during his presentation. And during the heat of the day, on average, the Black Angus heifers maintain about a 1 degree Celsius greater vaginal body temperature than do their half-sisters that are white. And so, along with that then, if we look at the forage intake and grazing characteristics, how much time do they spend in the shade? We find that significantly less time is spent seeking shade among the White Angus cows than do the Black Angus cows. But the amount of forage dry matter intake when provided free choice forage in a shaded environment does not differ between the two. We haven't seen differences. We haven't measured the efficiency yet. It could be that they eat less but grow the same and just are more efficient, but we don't see differences there. We have had bulls, white Angus bulls, at the Florida Bull Test up at Mariana in the GrowSafe system over 3 years, and we find that they run just about right in the middle of the group in terms of overall performance, body weight gain, and weight per day of age, but they tend to be towards the better end of the group in terms of overall efficiency. So, why are we selling the herd? The genetic diversity of the Ona White Angus is limited, as I showed you before. And we feel that this can be enhanced dramatically by investing in an aggressive embryo transfer program on those remaining foundation cows, which are getting older each year. But this is expensive. In addition, one of my advisory council members told me, as I was talking about some of the reasons why I didn't want to get rid of the herd, I think those are more personal reasons, because I like this cow herd. I've worked with them for a number of years. And he said it really is the university's responsibility to develop technologies and then turn those technologies over to private entities for commercialization. And that's really what seems to be happening here with this. And then we feel that the Ona White Angus has a lot of potential to impact beef production across the world, and particularly in warm climates, by introducing those genetics in a crossbreeding system.